I'm Jim Collison, and live from our virtual studios around the world, this is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on March 19th, 2021. Call to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, love to have you join us in our live YouTube chat. It's actually on the live page right above us there. There's a link that'll take you to YouTube. And sign in with your Google account. Join us in chat. We'll be taking your questions there. If you're listening on the podcast or on YouTube after the fact, you can always send us an email with your questions, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget, when you're on YouTube or in any podcast app, you can subscribe to stay up to date with all the things that we do. Dr. Jaclynn Robinson is our host today. She works as a learning and development consultant here at Gallup with me. And Jaclynn, it's always great to have you on Call to Coach. Welcome back.
Likewise. Thank you. Hello, my Call to Coachers. Welcome back.
We have a fabulous program ahead. I'm going to get out of the way. Why don't you introduce Robert and our guest today?
More than happy to. So today we've got two guests on. I'm continuing this tradition. I want to bring the talent to Call to Coach. So we have Allison Bebo, who is the Senior Vice President of Human Resources at Hologic. And Allie joined Hologic in February 2015 with 15 years of human resources experience. From 2000 to 2015, she held various human resources leadership positions at Ann Inc. and primarily focused on talent acquisition, associate relations, and talent management. So Allie, her top five, I know you all are curious, is individualization, maximizer, strategic, relator, and activator. So welcome, Allie, to the show.
Thank you. Nice to see you. And certainly I'm honored to be on this call.
Thank you. So alongside you today, we have Mr. Robert Gabsa. Robert is a workplace consultant here at Gallup who helps clients increase organizational performance by creating better employee and customer experiences. He also is involved in leadership coaching and development and creates workplace environments that really define and elevate organizational branding. His top five are ideation, woo, futuristic, strategic, and maximizer. So welcome, Robert.
Thanks. I am so excited to be here. This is great.
I'm stoked for today.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. So we've heard just across the board over this past season, we want to hear a story. We want to hear a real life experience. How are you using CliftonStrengths in the workplace? How is that used as a vehicle for higher engagement and performance? What does this look like? And last week when we talked about it, we talked about how it's not an overnight process. There's a strategy involved and there's a lot of thoughtful architecture involved in creating a thriving workplace. So I'm going to kick it over to you, Robert and Allie, because we would love to hear what the Hologic culture is about and how you created such an engaging culture.
Sure. I would love to just kind of kick it off with my experience at Hologic. I've been working, it's been almost 2 years, Allie, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Time flies when you're sitting at home in a room in front of a screen. But, it's, I'm definitely, I'm really, I would say enamored with Hologic. There's so many things that I found really unique about it. And when we started working with you, I was late to the team, right? The team has been there working with you from Gallup for, 5-6 years now, right? So this has been a journey together. But it was really, significant to me when I looked at the partnership that was created before I got there, and that I was immediately immersed into and welcomed into, kind of like with open arms. I think my first meeting there was like in this big conference room, right? And we're going to sit and we're going to be talking about some of the plans that we had for certain talent investment architectures, and I mean, it was like a hug fest, and I felt so at home. It really was. And everybody that was there on your team, the authenticity, the transparency, the encouragement to push back and have those tensions of, I don't agree and I disagree, and what do we think about this? And all of that felt so real. And I love that. I never felt ever that we were there, to like serve our client, which we are, but it was like such a joint effort. And I have to thank you also, because the other thing that I walked away from that very first day and that I have built upon over the past year is the fact that your purpose as an organization, that we'll touch on and we'll talk about how important that is, really truly became kind of an engagement point, and it becomes Gallup's purpose, right? And so I appreciate that, and I find it really unique in the way that you look at strengths, engagement, high performance in such a strategic manner is one of the reasons why I said, I've got the perfect person to talk about this. We've got to get Allie. I mean, really, I was like, Jaclynn, they are doing it like right in my eyes. So that's kind of my intro. That's really my intro. And I love it. So I would love to hear about your thoughts.
Yeah. So what I would start with, and I think it's important to frame in, my relationship with Gallup is about 20 years, and it's been incredibly formative for me when I think about my career and really honestly landing in human resources and staying in human resources. But I think, Robert, what you felt is, we look at our relationship with partners like you as true partnerships and not vendor relationships. And I think the piece that we really go after is we're inviting you into what I think is an incredible purpose and journey. And, for those of you that don't know about Hologic, I'll just do a quick commercial. We take great pride in knowing that there is no other company on the planet that has done more for cervical and breast cancer than Hologic over the past few decades. And it's really through our innovations. So I think innovation is a key word in cervical cancer with the ThinPrep, the test. So many of you women know what I'm talking about, our annual screening. We also test for HPV. We test for sexually transmitted infections via our molecular platforms. But we are also the inventor of the 3D mammogram. So when we think about breast cancer and detection, early detection of breast cancer, that's us. And so we take a lot of, take great pride in terms of what we do and the impact we have on the world. So Robert, I think to your point, when people are invited in and want to join, we we bring you on every step of the way. And, this year, we'll talk a little bit about it perhaps, but we were also on the front line for the world's fight against COVID. And we are one of the premier organizations that developed a COVID test, and a test that brings high sensitivity and specificity to the testing itself. And so, I think you'll hear throughout, we're very mission purpose driven, but I think the piece that Robert spoke to is, we anchor ourselves on a set of principles, and the first is, a firm belief that talent is an asset and talent makes a difference, and that's a big part of our journey is really kind of proving that out, really telling the story of our people and the impact they've made. But importantly, thinking about, engagement and our, obligation to those that join to create an organization that their talents can, be unlocked or unleashed, I like to say. And that's really, a big part of, I know the earlier conversations you guys have had is around, the importance of great managers and great coaches. And for us, engagement comes to life the most fully or more fully when you've got these great managers. But it is our sort of commitment to the talent we bring in to create a culture for them to do their best work and to bring, as I said earlier, those innovations that I spoke to, and respond to the world when they need us. So,
No, absolutely. And when I see, and we've worked with you on developing not only just everybody in your organization, right, from leadership down, but I know you have kind of a deep rooted stance on how important managers are, right? How
Oh, yeah.
important managers are in your organization. And yeah, at Gallup, we've talked about that. And I think the world is understanding how much influence they have, 70% influence on the engagement, right, of their teams. And
Yeah.
so I would love to hear, I'm a manager at Hologic. What does that mean? And how am I treated? How am I developed? What is it about managers there that is so important to helping you accomplish your mission and purpose?
Yeah, so that's such a great question, and it's been a journey, I think, for me over the last 6 years since I've joined to really, shape that point of view and get that understanding around at the leadership level. And in Gallup has talked about it, but that idea that the most important decision we make is who we name manager. And when I joined, I think managers were certainly more viewed as people that knew the work that needed to get done, so very functional in nature. And they didn't really have a kind of I'll call it a holistic view that it's know the stuff you're paid to do, like the work, but you're also paid to coach teams, develop teams, and create what we introduced the concept of engagement. And so, I think that the early years was that shift of kind of functional to people management. It sounds so simple, but that was part of the conversation. And that conversation was really anchored on a point of view that we use Gallup's Q12. And when we think about the 12 questions, we really shared with them, that is your roadmap. That's your roadmap to high performance, to innovation, to growth. But it's that simple. And so for us, it was, kind of framing in the importance of managers, but also that difference between it's not just what you think it is, it's this as well. And then we were able to really lean in on the concept of coaching and, really what that looks like and feels like, and really talk about, it's a continued conversation. It's continuous feedback. It's not event-based, wait till the end of the year type of thing.
Yes.
People how they're doing. But I think the beauty of Q12 is it was really anchoring a path for managers. And, once they, we spent a lot of time, investing in them. We had a year, I think we were calling it the year of the manager. And it was an all out equipping them with tools and resources and anchoring key principles and talking about why it matters. And telling their stories. We would also talk about those that were, top quartile, top decile in engagement with their teams. But at the end of the day, it sort of became this, or what I'd like to say now is, we've got over 70% of our population is working for a highly engaged, talented manager, and it feels totally different. It's almost, you stand out if you're not. And we don't have to call them out. I mean, it's just that obvious, and there's a lot of like peer accountability, and people see it. So, but I think it's a very disciplined march, so to speak, to focus on the things that matter, but anchor good investment and conversations around those things. As I like to say, it doesn't happen overnight, but you got to put some muscle into it.
Yeah.
That's such a perfect example. And you hear that it was a year of time of just focusing on managers, and there's consistency and discipline behind it. And oftentimes if someone says, how long might it take for us to switch gears and see our engagement increase, oftentimes we'll say it depends on how much work and commitment that you want to put into it, because some can turn it around really quickly if they're consistent and disciplined, and some it takes time. But I think you just showcased what a great example of, we were focused on it, we were committed, and we had a year of just the manager.
Right. And I think the piece that's been exciting for us is, I'd say, kind of the next level of investment was really bringing strengths to the organization. And that was, so we kind of like laid the foundation around, engagement is the path, but started to kind of unpack, when we talk about, I get to do what I do best every day. And, people, kind of know me, respect me, are thinking about my growth. We also invested very heavily in, I think everybody, I want to say close to 90% of our employees have access to their strengths. And that was another, I'd say, I'll call it accelerator to engagement, aimed towards performance, but it was another tool in their toolkit to think about those types of, conversations, meaningful conversations with their team. And it's also, for us, we love strengths, and you're all strengths coaches on the call, that concept of a common language and understanding. At the same time, this view that, especially with people that have similar roles as somebody else, that it's okay to take a different path to get the same outcome. So it's done a lot to kind of unlock, I think, some really robust conversations, but also been an accelerator to engagement for us.
Yeah, I remember something you had said one point that stuck with me, Allie, about, it had something to do, and you will remember it maybe better than I, but when you said unleashing them.
Yeah.
Right. And I also really appreciate and respect the fact that, you find talented people, right? You figure out what they do best, and you do look at, what are their strengths? How do we invest in their development? The key is, the why is engagement, right? Because we all know higher engagement equals higher performance. And strengths is one of the accelerators with the talent. So it's like it all has this nice little formula, and it's great because when you think about it, it makes so much sense. But when I've seen it in action, right, and I've seen managers there that take the time, and for example, just with your, some of the things that you're doing with managers, like having quarterly conversations and doing more of a coaching and doing check-ins and making sure, especially now, right, when not everybody's on site. I know some of your facilities are more on site, some are hybrid, right? Some are still remote, which probably probably presents a whole new bucket of issues for managers, because now I'm not just managing, I'm managing kind of 3 different types of environments, right? But it's the engagement they have. How did that help?
I'll say, one of the things I'm just so proud of, and is so important for companies, is to not cut things like engagement surveys when times are tough. That is, or investment, with your people. And COVID for us, I like to think of, it was really an opportunity to lean in and care for and be attentive to our people and understand where they are. And when I think about engagement as an organization, and I think about COVID, we have this phrase that you want to stay ready, not get ready. And in some ways, the work we had done ahead of, start of 2020, March 2020, really prepared us. And I think, we have a kind of a leadership quote that we talk about is, tough times reveal, our character. And I like to think of tough times also revealed our strengths. And in so many ways, people in these difficult times leaned into their strengths. I mean, I call it almost their survival skills. And it got the best of them. In some cases, they didn't get to use them as much, but it really did reveal what they needed to lean on to get through some challenging times. And I think engagement with strengths, to me, was a big part of, our resilience, as well as our ability to be able to respond with the innovation that we did around the COVID response. Well, first off, our organizational DNA has a lot of bias to action. But we definitely looked at, this idea of, kind of leaning into those things that were important now. And a big part of that was leaning into our strengths.
Yeah. Yeah. Jaclynn, did you?
I was just looking at the chat box here, and this might be what you're just saying. I think even ties into a question asked, which is, how would you verbalize the concept that demonstrating the value of an individual fosters engagement? The role of strengths unleashing, how does it equate to valuing? And it sounds a lot like it's easy for people to see they're connecting how their strengths apply to the mission of Hologic and what's valuable to you all, but the managers can connect with that too, to say, oh, if I focus on what they do best every day, if I'm paying attention to their strengths and I'm showing how they contribute to the mission, it's going to foster that engagement. What would you actually say, though? Because that's my perspective and hypothesis, but we would love to hear from you how you connected strengths and the value of an individual.
Yeah, we tend to think about this in the context of belongingness and what it means to feel like I am regarded for the differences that I bring. And that's a big part of it, is valued and respected for those differences. And the cool thing with strengths is that we can say nobody has the same, I doubt, the odds are in Hologic, there's not the same 34 themes in the same sequence. But a big part of what we're talking about is just, I belong here because I'm respected and I'm understood for the differences that I bring. I work with a lot of people on my team that have the same role, but they're not, I don't treat them, that's clearly my individualization, but I don't manage them the same. But a big part for us is that, you are here for a reason, and your talents matter, but it's also recognizing and respecting that those differences make us better. So I don't know if answers.
Beautifully said.
I think it does.
But we're definitely about the individual as a part of the team as the part of the organization, and really stitching that all together.
Yeah, I've noticed in just some of my interactions with a lot of people at Hologic that they do feel valued. They do feel valued, because I even love the fact that one of the first things that we brought into some of the work that we were doing with you year before last was applying this for managers specifically, but it was our CEI, our Coaching Effectiveness Index. And it was able to look at things like my opinion, by taking some of the Q12 and being able to really look at which managers have teams that feel like they're really being coached and they're really being appreciated and valued and individualized, and how much that makes them feel, right? Because it really comes down to, how do I feel? Am I cared about? The more I cared about and the better I feel, the more I'm going to show up and the better I'm going to perform. And that we would be remiss if, I look at some of this journey, and I know your journey goes, it was a year for About the Manager, but it's taken Hologic from starting engagement 7 years ago.
Yeah, 7 years the survey's been in place.
Yeah, and I've looked at the steady, and then hitting 96 percentile, hitting amazing engagement at the end of 2019, right? And then, or at the beginning, 2019, it was, you got the Don Clifton Strength-Based Culture Award. January, you got your Q12 results. Beginning of February, just absolutely blew out of the water the engagement. And then March, COVID hit. And I remember the conversation I had with our team internally. We knew COVID hits. they have more important things to think about than us right now. But I bet, right? But I bet because of this engagement, I want to see what's going to happen. And COVID hit, Hologic answered and helped the world. Now, can you just tell us a little bit about how you pivoted? What were you doing versus what did you do?
Keyword of the pivot.
I mean, the test kits, everything was like, here comes the cavalry.
It was, I think as HR professionals, everyone was sort of, old rules, old ways, we're not relevant. What's the new rules and the new ways? And again, I think what we, and some of that was, what can we do? How can we help you? And I'm like, we really leaned into, again, I'll call it that roadmap. And that opportunity when we were faced with, shifting priorities. And we really focused on, I'll call, stability, right? Just, calming where we could and not, it was always a balance. We were all trying to navigate what this was going to be. And we didn't know where we were going to go and how we were going to be able to respond. But it was, I'd say definitely kind of, when I think about engagement as a in terms of basic needs and the shifting priorities, what we did is we said, let's really lean in on what's most important. And it really was, I think, all the way, from every leader, manager, it was, let's just focus on the few things, because we've got to really prioritize, again, financial stability and the business and our customers. So, like I said, engagement almost was like, first thing you do, clarify expectations, what's expected of me. Equipping our teams, so those tools and materials, that was, we knew that it wasn't just the laptops, it wasn't just, allowing people to be able to set up successfully in the office, but it was also information. So that connectivity, I think that teams already had with each other and with their managers. I like to think that a big part of tools and materials was access to information and communication, and just that connectivity. So, and that's kind of early days, but as we started to really understand more fully what we as Hologic could do to respond, with developing the test, that is a whole nother part of our story, which is, Robert, to your point, the fuel was in the engine. Our employees were engaged. And when you're engaged and there's a problem to be solved at the global level, our diagnostics team, that was like all they did, going back to clarifying what was most important now. And they did, they moved mountains. They put through Herculean efforts to develop a test in very fast fashion. But I fully argue that it has so much to do with just that level of engagement they started with. And then I talked earlier about our purpose. You just aim them towards our purpose. It just flows. So I hope that helped. There's sort of a two-part story. There's the response diagnostic side, and there's a response to those that aren't, we've got multiple divisions with multiple customers and multiple products. So, but in the end, high touch, focus, clarity on what's most important. But just also, we were ready, I guess was the other thing. I said that earlier. We didn't have to get ready. We were ready.
You were ready. And I think in some of the interviews that I had done with people, the fact that they felt that they were being valued, they felt that they were being individualized, that they were being recognized for their own natural talents and strengths, got them engaged. And that high engagement, absolutely, to me, that was such a clear link to high performance, that you could pivot like that. Like a team a company that had low engagement would not have responded that way, right?
No. A lot
And
more distractions, that's for sure.
lot more.
I mean, you'd have to address a lot more. You'd be addressing a whole different batch of issues, so to speak.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, but it was complicated. It was a time I don't think anyone ever wants to go back to. But as I reflect, it was a couple key things that we did, and the other thing that I would be remiss is, we have a fantastic CEO in Steve McMillan who, part of the journey we've been on is also, having and building an awesome leadership team. I mean, I'm just so fortunate to work with the leaders that I work with, and we're not edict driven, so we didn't respond with mandates and edicts. We really listened to our teams and were responsive to what was going on and understanding where they were. But it also is a story of just a very strong leadership team, of being aligned and being there for the broader organization. And that's the other key piece. You got to have real strong leaders at the top.
Yeah, I agree. It helps. We do so much, right, Jaclynn, and some of the work that we do with certain companies or some companies that are struggling with that, I'll say that feeling of no matter what, I'm going to stay in the fight.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of that is, getting people to feel honestly and truly connected to the mission of the organization, to the purpose of the organization, to why are we here? Why do we show up every day? And how do we do that? And I think something else that was really unique that I saw is using that appreciation and value of all of your people throughout the organization to really kind of step up and be innovative. I think you had said one time, if you have a playbook and you have guardrails and you put a fence around them, they're like sheep, right? We don't have a playbook.
Yeah. So I
There's trust.
back to my individualization and just, a belief that what we do is unique to us, and it's sort of the unconventional and Hologic way. But to your point is, one of the things that it was super important to me coming in is that we would lead more from a principle-based approach versus a rules-based. And that tends to be, you prescribe, turn left, turn right, you tell them exactly how to do their job. And to your point, Robert, it's when you're truly strength-based, you don't put fences around people, because otherwise when you put fences around people, they show up and act like sheep. So, true. That's, and it's, and I think, and that was again back to just, how do you, going back to unleashing talent. I mean, don't box them in, don't fence them in, and that's kind of our belief. And back to the leadership piece, our view of leadership is, similar to manager, and it is so important who we name leader, who we bring in, who we promote into these roles. And, I think they set the tone. But at the same time, when you hire really great leaders, you don't, it's sort of like, it takes care of a lot of things, it's leadership finds a way. And that's a big part of our story too, is just let talent find a way.
Yeah.
This ties into so much that we've talked about this season, and I just love hearing it come to life with you all at Hologic, because one of the things we talked about earlier this year was leaders and how they can inspire through their messaging.
Yeah.
And you hired the right talent. You hired leaders that were all on the same page and knew how to communicate and inspire at a time of crisis. And then another thing that we had talked about was the 4 needs of followers. And it sounds like the leaders and managers did that so well, because as you're talking, we hear trust. The trust was there. There had already been manager development. They were high talent. You had leadership that was high talent. The compassion was there. We see individuals for who they are. We trust them. We know they're going to be more innovative. They're going to be able to identify best practices and really be engaged if we just trust them and we don't have a guidebook. And then you hear that hope. this is a
Yeah.
time of crisis, but we can actually do something about it. Let's go
Yeah.
forth and move forward. And that was once you had
Yeah,
that
well
stability
said.
in place.
Yeah, well said. Because
Expectations.
I didn't say it, but that was our roadmap, was the kind of the followers' needs, looking at the 4 followers' needs, and
Yeah.
stability was key. And I think the trust in us was there.
Mhm.
So a lot of what we leaned into is sort of, we knew we need to be very careful, right? Don't commit to something you can't deliver on. So that was always it was always a top of mind. And we even thought about that with our customers, our especially on the testing front, we couldn't keep up with the demand as with our supply, in the early days, as we were still ramping up, but we didn't want to overcommit, but it was so important we maintain that trust and live into our word. But inside Hologic as well, the stability piece was super important. But the compassion you said earlier, we had to make some tough choices early days, and they were tough choices that affected people's livelihood and having to do furloughs or reduction in pay. But it goes back to that, someone at work cares about me. We were in a really good position where I think managers were able to have those difficult conversations. And at the same time, there was that trust that when we get through this, we would really firmly believe we'd emerge stronger. But that, we would make it right for them, for lack of better words. And so that the followers' needs was a big part of what our leaders thought about. And, our purpose always gives us hope. It's a big mobilizer for us in terms of what we do. And we just rallied behind how we could give the world hope, frankly, in being able to get through this and be better on the other side. So that's great. Wow.
Yeah. You all did wonderful. You see that too. I've been on the San Diego campus a few times, and you just feel purpose and see purpose come to life. And the employees truly live it and breathe it, from leadership level to individual contributor level. So it's wonderful.
Yeah,
it always gives me goosebumps just thinking about the impact you all have.
It is where the magic happened for Hologic. Our diagnostics teams, they're phenomenal. They're, from the R&D scientists who developed it, to supply chain folks, from regulatory to manufacturing and ops that, actually made the test, and then logistics who shipped it. It's been really amazing to watch that site. And that site they never closed. Clearly they wouldn't close in what we just talked about, but our leaders were there working alongside them. That was another part of our response and just showing up for our teams is, a lot of organizations moved, everybody to hybrid or everybody to remote. And we really wanted to be, for those of us that were there, our president, our CEO, the leadership team was there with our teams during that entire time. And that was very important to them.
Yeah. You'd mentioned furloughs and those tough decisions that you had made early on. Tough decisions that the world had to make, right? Our company falls into that same category, but it really stuck out to me, and again it spoke volumes to me when I was talking to somebody at one of your divisions, and she said, I was coaching. She said, I think the hardest day that I've had at Hologic was the day that I had to tell, not 2 people, but a group of people that they were being furloughed. And I remember crying, and I remember feeling it was the hardest thing I ever had to do. And she said, and then I think the happiest, best day that I ever had at Hologic was when I was told that we could bring them all back, and every single one of them came back. They didn't go somewhere else. They didn't, have bad feelings. They were ready to, again, jump right back into the fight, whether it was COVID or whether it was breast cancer. It didn't matter. that purpose of the more we can do, the more lives we're going to save. It's that whole thing, right? Let's allow people to live better lives, and that purpose, I think, and I heard from a couple of people, I couldn't imagine working for any other manager, which speaks volumes about your managers.
Right. Which goes, and I think to your point, I mean, I think about meaningful conversations and just the role that managers play. And again, they were not easy. And it was, very difficult. And, the piece that we were really proud of, and again, I know it's COVID related, but this idea that we stayed really close to those folks while they were on furlough. And, we made sure that those connections were made and they felt still a part of the team. And it was another really cool example of, and I say this in an interesting way, like their engagement was maintained. And the evidence of that is we had, the recruiters within HR, we shut down recruiting. So that was for us in HR, that was really difficult in the US, is to sort of shut down recruiting for, some time. And when we brought them back and we were looking at this significant expansion in San Diego in the diagnostics division, we threw our recruiters in Manchester, UK, and San Diego, California, on this opportunity to attract and bring in, many more. We went on a hiring spree, obviously, and they were phenomenal. It was like they never skipped a day of work, and they jumped right in and probably had one of the most rewarding opportunities in their career. Many of them were like, that was one of the best growth opportunities, was coming back, but they didn't skip a beat. And when the same thing happened with some acquisitions, where we brought some people back to come back and work on some acquisitions, and didn't skip a beat. So, again, that goes back to, I think, that care and compassion in the conversations ahead of, and then during, and then when they came back, it was just, you were so happy to have them, but they just jumped right in. So, again, this was a journey getting to this place, but I'm so excited about, what we did, but I'm also excited about, in 2021, it's a different conversation. Now it's about what kind of, how can we talk about emerging stronger, which we firmly believe we have, but what more can we do? And how do we, pivot to these, real opportunistic, exciting, transformational opportunities that isn't in response to COVID and ramping business back up, but just, growing even more.
Yeah, keeping that innovation, that agility as more of a daily practice as opposed to a response. I think in one of the interviews, I think it was an interview on
21, proactive.
Well, I think it was Kevin. I think it was Kevin Thornell, president in diagnostics, who said, I think it was him or Steve on CSNBC, that said, sure, COVID made us jump like 2 years ahead. Yes. And now we're just going to keep operating at that same speed. And imagine how many more lives we're going to make better because of it. How much more of our purpose we can deliver. It wasn't how much more money we're going to make or what's going to happen to our stock. I mean, the people heard, think of how many more lives we're going to impact, I mean, I think it's great, and people feeling like that because they're valued, because they're appreciated, because their opinions count, because all of those things, and their strengths are known, their talents are known. Their managers try to put them in positions or in roles or in assignments where they can absolutely do what they do best as much as possible. It makes them feel, how people feel directly relates to how they perform. And I think you've done such a great job at that, making people the trust, they feel stability, they feel compassion, they do feel hope. I hadn't really thought about the 4 needs of followers until we brought it up now, but I think about it and I think, wow, that was really very present. Yeah.
It was very much top of mind. Yeah. For us, and still is, right? I mean, it's just a good, I think for leaders, we think they have all the answers, and so it's always nice to have some frameworks and something to kind of ground and have a common approach. And that was another theme, I think, with Hologic, when I think about leadership, is, they, our employees really look to us to guide and to lead. And I think we brought a high degree of confidence and credibility that, you're in good hands.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, we balanced that with humility and this idea of, we didn't have all the answers. We're very much active in listening to understand what was going on. We love this idea that innovation and great ideas can happen anywhere in the organization. So there's that balance that I think we brought as well. That was really important, because not only did we go through COVID, but in the U.S., we certainly had George Floyd murder and the BLM movement, and so there was just a lot of sensitive topics and moments that we really had to pause and reflect and listen and understand what was going on with our employees.
Yeah.
Yeah, well said. You hear the humility and vulnerability to just be open and creating that safety for people to be able to share out. Because we have been saying, there was a COVID pandemic, but there were so many more that also happened over the past year. BLM being one of them, where, we feel like we're just in one pandemic after another.
Yeah.
And now we're talking so much about well-being and burnout, and how do you even broach that topic? But you all have created that safety net, no matter what comes down the pipeline, because the trust and rapport and that humility and vulnerability is there, where they feel like they can open up, is what it sounds like.
Yeah. And I mean, for us, like I said, 2021 there's just a lot of energy around, what we can do. And, I think, Robert, you said, we were able to accelerate, some of the capital investment that was in the queue over a 5 or 6 year period, and do it in, I think, 6 months. So the cool thing for us now, as we look to the future, we are, I think, still ambitious, but there's so much we know we can do. And one of the things that COVID did for Hologic is it raised our profile globally, and it put us at the forefront and in front of, health ministers and prime ministers. And it's really been really exciting for us, because a lot of doors have opened up. And so, if we look at, kind of the brand of Hologic and who we are, it's been phenomenal. But the other piece that, and I think about, being really purposeful about investment and thinking about the future and thinking about our purpose and what we can do for the world. We launched recently publicly that Gallup and Hologic together are building the very first women's health index, a global women's health index. And I say that because this is an index that will be the only measurement in the world that understands the state of women's health. And it's going to be, it is actually in the field right now. It has been being asked through the world poll that Gallup delivers. So thank you all. The opportunity for us is to really understand the state of women's health across, I think it's like 116 countries. We're talking to 120,000 individuals across 40 languages or so. But the index itself is a real opportunity for us to work closely with governments, work closely with customers, but really start to frame in, what is the gap, the existing gap between what a country says, is their public policy and practices around, screening, compliance, and access to care. But it's really going to almost shine a mirror up to them to say, well, here's what your women are saying. Here's what women in your country are saying. So very powerful, and one for us that is, again, as I think about Hologic's profile and the difference we can make, we think of ourselves as global champions of women's health. And this is that opportunity to put us more fully on the center stage, to really help governments, national leaders, countries, private sector, just really make those improvements that are necessary. And COVID affected women disproportionately more than men. I mean, that is a fact. So
yeah, you're learning a lot, and you will be the world's foremost expert on women's health. 3.9 billion women in the world.
3.9 billion, women in the world, and
you're going to learn so much.
We're going to learn about them. So yeah.
So impactful, so purposeful. Yeah. You've got cheers in the audience for that too. That's
absolutely.
Just it's great. It's
a gift. It's a gift.
It is. It's needed. We've seen the disparity just grow with COVID between men and women. So
yeah. So Google womenshealthindex.com and you'll be able to see you'll be able to read about it. But again, it goes back to just living into your purpose and not cutting out the things that are going to drive long-term value for the world and for our people.
Well said.
Well said. Well said, Allie.
It's a perfect way to wrap up our.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to let her leave without something I've never thanked. And you're the representative, right? So I should be thanking a lot more people at Hologic, but early detection saved my sister's life. So thank you for what you do.
Wow. Oh, Robert, I'm so glad. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you for what you do.
Yeah, we like to think, we don't just, we're not just about women's health, we're about global health.
Absolutely.
Women's health is something that we all take personally. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Allie, before we wrap this, kind of one question as we kind of look to the future, we talked a lot about managers and the things you did for managers early on to help with that. And what great timing to bolster your managers right before the pandemic, right? What if you could do one additional thing as we go into recovery, and I'm just gonna say that, like, we're headed into recovery. One thing you're hoping for your managers, management team, organization, leadership team, however you want to do that. What's your hope for that? What else would you like to do, or what's on the horizon a little bit for you around your own leadership and ways to continue to bolster them? They're beaten up, right? They've come out of this. This has been hard for everybody, right?
Yeah.
So how do we build them back up?
Yeah, I'd be remiss, and we said it briefly, but well-being is on our minds, and just knowing that, and I said earlier about women being disproportionately impacted. We're aware that people have had to make some choices in pulling themselves out of the workforce, or stepping back from their career aspirations. So it is on my mind. Just how do we get in front of that and think about, we're certainly thinking through kind of that return to office and looking at hybrid and bringing some structure and flexibility so that is something that, I guess it's not, we're not out of the woods, we're not fully vaccinated. We're still having to, in some cases work in hybrid situations with our kids at school. So I think for managers, it's just helping them. There's a part of me, it's like, how do we help them have those types of conversations? I've talked a lot about, I think the personal is bled into the professional and vice versa, which a lot of us love. You don't see her now, but my cat pops up and around, and, we see baby on Zoom calls. But that is definitely, I think, what's on managers' mind is how do I approach those more difficult conversations, and then at the same time, how do we think about overall well-being for our employees? Because it's we love our state of engagement of our employees, but we know that there might be spouses and family members that when they go and sit at the dinner table, they're very different conversations. Mm-hmm. That is on my mind. It's just how to don't lose sight of that.
With
proud
that,
of where we are, but there's a whole household in some cases that may not be in the same position.
Yeah. With that, I'll put a little plug in for Theme Thursday for season 6. We talk about that dynamic between work and home and how our themes can interact that way. And I think when we did season 6, last year, we didn't see this coming. And I think now that folks have been home so long, that blend is even stronger than it was before. And then how do we, as we transition back to whatever that new mode is, what does that look like now with who we were before, who we're going to be in the future, and how we can apply our own unique talents to it, right? So I think we have some amazing times coming up. I mean, I'm pretty excited about recovery, and not just from the sense of getting back to normal, which I don't know if we'll ever do, but from a sense of there's such great opportunities to do these things. Jaclynn, we're at the end of our time. Take a second and thank our guests for coming today, and then let's wrap this. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you too. This was one of the most purposeful conversations, if not the most purposeful conversation that I've been able to engage in this season. So it's wonderful just to hear it come to life, all of these concepts and practices and even actions that we've been talking about through the course of the season, hearing it all in one organization that is doing such fantastic work and important work for women in global health. It was a pleasure to have you both on. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We are hearing it in the chat. They're appreciative of it as well. Hologic is a champion of all of us.
Yes, we are.
And then next week, next Friday, everybody, we will have Ruth and Jackie on, our executive coaches, to share out best practices they have with coaching. Yeah. So.
Yeah, you know them.
Yes.
I know them.
Oh yeah.
That's awesome.
The excitement is there. So let's they will wrap us up for this particular leadership series until we discuss teams later in the summer.
All right.
Back over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all.
It's a
pleasure.
Allie, Robert, thanks. I'm not going to lie. I hid myself because I cried a couple times while you guys were talking. Pretty amazing story. And we get these incredible opportunities, but the mission is so strong. So thanks for both of you sharing that.
Yeah.
Robert, I was thinking about you and I early pandemic days, sat down and we did the series on the 5 ways building a strengths-based culture. You and I did that together, little 20-minute sessions. You were in the firefight at Hologic when we were recording those. And so just I kind of think about how coincidental, ironic, whatever words you want to use in there, how meaningful those are today in this conversation. I was thinking back to those times you and I shared together doing that. And then Allie, to hear it from you as how that kind of played out in that role and how you guys have taken that strengths-based culture seriously in what you're doing.
Working with them during that fire, Jim, helped me deliver that series of building a strength-based culture because I had like the role model at my side. So it was very easy for me.
It was
absolutely
great. I was just thinking about recording that series with you this whole time. Oh, Robert said that. Oh yeah, I remember. He said that. So if you want to go back to last year, just go to gallup.com/CliftonStrengths in the search box, search strengths-based culture, and you'll see our whole series that is there. They're all linked to each other. And if you want more Robert, he is there as well. A couple reminders also, if you have any questions, you can send those in to us, coaching@gallup.com. If you want coaching, you want to get some master coaching or learn how to be Gallup certified strengths coach, or maybe engage with us like Hologic has done, send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. We'll get somebody to call you back right away. Don't forget the 2021 virtual strengths. Why am I having trouble with that? The virtual Gallup at Work, there we go, summit is coming up June 8th and 9th, and we'd love you to be a part of it. You can get more information, gallup@work.com. Find us anywhere by searching Clifton Strengths. And we want to thank you for joining us today. And some of you already said this. If you found this useful, please share it. We'd love you to be able to do that. Join us next Friday. As Jaclynn said, we got a great one coming up. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks, everybody.